I'm Kevin Scott and I'm the Northern Reserves Officer for Cumbria Wildlife Trust. Drumruff is, in terms of the habitat, it's predominantly what's called a lowland raised mire or a lowland raised bog. And lowland raised mires in England have suffered an immense decline. We've lost approximately 97% of our lowland raised mire. And so just for the habitat alone, in terms of trying to protect a remnant habitat, that's vitally important. And it is a unique habitat as well. Most habitats sort of would arguably, to some extent or other, want to become scrub or woodland if left completely to their own devices. Whereas a lowland raised mire is pretty much what is called the ecological climax community. In a lowland raised mire like Drumruff, that amount of peat has been building since the last ice age, so for about 10,000 years. I think the deepest I have experienced personally is around about 10 meters. So maybe a meter accumulation for every 1,000 years. Just shows how long it takes. Basically, peat is effectively mostly sphagnum moss. And sphagnum moss can hold, it's like a sponge. If you pick up a piece of sphagnum, even on a relatively dry day, and squeeze it, it can hold something like, I think it's something like 7 or 8 times its own mass in water. So when you stand on a bog, you're standing on basically a giant sphagnum sponge. And as I say, in terms of habitat, vitally important. And it's absolutely crazy that something that is so important, we have destroyed largely to put dirt in our gardens, because that's the cause of most of the destruction. It affects people not just from urban areas, but it affects people in the sense of it acts as a carbon store, so it mitigates against climate change. I think everyone is familiar with the sort of concept of, if we chop down all the rainforest, we're going to get into terrible trouble because, it's so good at storing carbon. Well, rainforest is an amateur at storing carbon compared to peat. Peat is about 3 or 4 times, I think, more efficient. Again, arguably, it is Britain's only true wilderness. The single most important factor in their destruction is harvesting for peat, for compost, for horticultural and gardening. Virtually all of our bogs have been drained around the edges to some extent to reclaim land for agricultural practices. There's a big discussion to be had there because obviously people make a living off that land, and that's important. And I haven't really mentioned blanket bog, which is by and large an upland habitat, equally important and equally endangered, and that's the more important habitat in terms of, let's say, things like flooding, because where we're standing, it's a grazed field. The grass is very short. You don't have a lot of structural variety. There's no scrub, there's no trees, there are no sort of little bushes. The grass is more or less all one height, and that affects how the water moves across the land as well. So, if you imagine a system where you have intact blanket mire up on a hill, and as you move off that blanket mire, you're into long grass, scrubby vegetation with trees and a whole mixture of stuff going on, rather than what we mostly have, which is a close cropped sward, then even if water is moving off the surface of the blanket bog, it is being slowed down by that rough, varied vegetation. Whereas if it comes off the blanket bog onto a compacted, drained, closely cropped sward, the water is going to move across that a lot faster. And then obviously that has downstream effects. upland blanket bog tends to be more important from a wider range of people's perspectives, because the impacts are that bit greater. And the loss of habitat and the damage to that habitat unquestionably increases the likelihood of flooding. Even some of the flood defences that we've put in, and when organisations like the Environment Agency put up flood defences, they always calculate for future levels, and even there they've been overtopped by flood water, which just shows the problem that we're dealing with. It isn't one simple solution. So there's been a lot of talk, for example, about dredging rivers, and I just don't accept that that's in any way sustainable or in fact beneficial. But a major part of the solution, a really fundamental part of the solution, is how we manage our upstream land. And particularly in areas like Cumbria, we shouldn't be continuing to drain this land for, practices that are economically marginal at best. Forestry, farming, those sorts of things. We do need to make sure that, farmers farm, and that people are able to make a living out of the land. But we need to do so in a way that, doesn't cause downstream environmental problems, and that should be possible. And unfortunately now, because of the way our peatlands have been protected, they're all designated as sites of special scientific interest, or the ones that are considered restorable, and also special areas of conservation, which is a European designation. But unfortunately, because they've been so degraded, the area that's protected is drawn immediately around the remaining peat habitat. And what that means is, because it excludes the agricultural fields that are around the edges of most of our bogs. And basically what that means is, unfortunately, we don't have the edge habitat. We just have, we're able to try and restore the peat, but we don't have the fen, we don't have the woodland that should be there. So what I would like to see is actually our ability to bring some of the agricultural land that is around the edges of the bog into those sorts of agreements that will allow us to restore the edge habitats. It is, after all, marginal agricultural land, but it is something that a farmer is making a living off, doing things in a certain way, and so we have to win those people over to come to an agreement with us as to how those lands should be managed, can be managed, and compensating them or paying them in some way for any loss that they incur by allowing us to do that sort of thing. So, effects to the sort of natural environment and habitat are slow in coming. What I hope I'm doing, and what I hope Cumbria Wildlife Trust and other conservation organisations are doing, are putting in place processes that will benefit future generations. That's the sort of positive outlook. Part of me sometimes gets a little bit negative about it, and I remember, we have to do first aid courses for, as part of our work, because we're outdoors a lot in remote locations. And I remember one of the first aid trainers telling me, don't forget, you're never saving a life, you're just slowing down a death. And in my more negative days, I kind of feel that's what we're doing in terms of the natural environment. And I hope that that's the wrong view. And I hope that other people and future generations will take a more positive interest than we seem to be at the moment.